You can see me okay, right?
Hi, my name is Jackie. Geez, sorry. Hi, this is Jackie here with the Sexy Politico. I am here talking with Kevin McShan. Now, Kevin here is a podcaster, a journalist. He has a podcast of his own. And I was wondering if you could tell my audience a little bit more about you before we get on to the questions.
Yeah, absolutely, Jackie. First and foremost, it's great to be with you today, and I'm honored to be here. My name is Kevin McShan, Jackie, and
Oh, I apologize.
no problem. I was born with what's called spastic quadriplegia cerebral palsy. It simply means that I don't have enough oxygen in my legs to walk normally. But Jackie, I always say that I can either work for my circumstances or have my circumstances work for me, and I choose to have my circumstances work for me. A little bit about my background: I graduated, as you said, with a journalism degree. I'm also a motivational speaker, and I do host a podcast called Let's Have This Conversation, which the mission behind the show is to have meaningful conversations that move the needle of progress forward. I started the podcast about 2.5 years ago, and I've already surpassed over 600 episodes. So that's a little bit about me and where I come from. So I'm looking forward to our conversation this afternoon.
So, so Kevin, my podcast, the Sexy Politico, is deals mostly with political issues, and in the United. So, just for the audience to know, Kevin here is from Canada, so it's so slightly different political rules, but here we just had an election last month, and a lot of the discussion was about access. There was a lot of discussion about accessibility in polling places and things of that nature. It at different polling locations, and how many polling locations didn't have wheelchair ramps, didn't allow for the ballots to be read to people, different issues like that. Do you have the same issues in Canada as we do in the United States?
Well, yeah, it's funny you should mention that. So my dad is actually American, so I'm well versed in both American and Canadian politics. But to answer your question, we over here in Canada, we have something called the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act, which is uh, a commitment by the government to make the province of Ontario for reference to your audience that don't know the difference between provinces and states. So provinces would be like Michigan, for example. So it would be the equivalent to our state government. So we have something here in Ontario called the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act, which is essentially um, a commitment by the government to make every aspect of the province accessible by 2025. So to answer your question, things like voting and equality is something that we do deal with over here in Canada. Well, as you said, we have a slightly different political system, but yeah, we tend to deal with the same issues in terms of fighting for equality and equity, making sure that things like representation of folks with disabilities, for instance, 80% of our non-disabled counterparts are employed here in Canada, and only 59% of our disabled counterparts are. And it's something that I have fought for throughout the duration of my adult life, Jackie, because I'll tell you a quick story. So I graduated college in 2010, and I didn't receive my first paying job anyway until 2016. So I know all about fighting for equity and equality. That's one of the reasons I became a motivational speaker, was because none of the journalism arenas would hire me because they were concerned having a disability, and at the time they were concerned about insurance. So we deal with some of the same issues surrounding diversity, equity, and inclusion for sure. So I hope that answers your question.
Oh, it definitely does. My older sister is autistic, and the one of the big things that she has to deal with is this program in the United States called SSI, which is money that the government gives to people along with disabilities, along with health insurance. But she cannot have more than 2,000 American dollars in equity, or else she loses her health insurance and any benefits that she has whatsoever. It's honestly forced poverty because it's the same rules across the board, no matter what sort of disability you have. Do do Canadians have to deal with issues like that?
Yeah, so the I guess the Canadian version of SSI here in Ontario is something we call ODSP, which stands for the Ontario Disability Support Program. Each province in Ontario has their own excuse me. Each province in Canada has their own version of this program. It's essentially uh, social services for folks with disabilities. And for the longest time, I know this because I was on ODSP. For the longest time, you could have no more than $5,000 in a bank account at one time. Now, I think they've upped that, I believe, to 40,000 now here in Canada, but there are similar restrictions for people with disabilities if they're on social assistance. And one of the frustrating parts is that you can't get ahead on if you can only have a certain amount of money in a bank account, right? So it's still the same uh, over here in Canada as it would be in the States. One thing I will tell you is our government is working towards what's called a basic guaranteed income, which is essentially a pot of money or an amount of money that each person with a disability is uh, guaranteed. I think it's called Bill C-22, and one of the things that Bill C-22 would do in Canada would be to guarantee a certain level of income for folks with disabilities. So we have some of the same barriers to entry to the rest of the world that you do in America, here in Canada as well. So to answer your question, there are similarities for sure.
What do you think that we could do as voters to help people with disabilities?
As voters, vote people in who want to employ people with disabilities. I always tell people, Jackie, that there's no 50% off policy when you have a disability. It's not like you get out of the womb and tell yourself, "Oh, I want to sign up for this disability." And I always tell people that people with disabilities have to pay taxes too. And but as I mentioned before, the barrier to entry to work. That's why I always say one of the taglines of my life, Jackie, is that inclusion is the gateway to independence, because you have to be able to include people in order for them to contribute equally to society. So, from a political standpoint, I want to see more emphasis on the need to employ folks with disabilities and not sort of give them a hand out, but a hand up in terms of finding meaningful employment for folks with disabilities. Because if you employ them, it's a less strain on the political system from a social service perspective. So to answer your question from a voting perspective, it's time to vote people in who want to hire people with disabilities so that they can contribute to the conversation of progress for sure.
I honestly think we need to be voting more people with disabilities into public office as well.
Well, yeah, that's a fair point because representation matters, and people with disabilities have got to solve problems every day. They've got to overcome obstacles and find solutions to problems. So I agree with you there because representation matters. People have to see themselves in prominent roles in order for them to feel as if they're included in society, and serving in public office is certainly one way to do that.
Now, in the United States, Congress, we have some disabled congressmen, but most of them are people who have lost limbs due to combat or due to automobile accidents. But we don't have people who have disabilities that are not due to accident or injury. And I would like to see more people who are in public office who have disabilities that are not due to accident or injury.
Oh, well, like we were just saying, representation matters, and people with disabilities um, have a unique skill set. I believe that when you hire someone with a disability, you also um, create an environment of higher morale and better morale and reduced turnover, and they tend to stay in office or their jobs longer. So certainly hiring or electing more officials to public office with a disability would continue certainly that conversation of progress for sure.
Yes. So what could we do as individuals on a day-to-day basis to help people with, I mean, I know that giving a hand out doesn't actually really help, but what could I do to help people with disabilities?
There are a lot of people with disabilities, and I'm speaking from personal and current experience. There are a lot of people with disabilities that are socially isolated and that are put into um, sort of a bucket or a silo of a situation. So one thing that I wanted to start my podcast for was to alleviate some of the social isolation that I was personally feeling. So I think for anyone who wants to be an ally to a person with a disability, uh, you have to fight for societal inclusion in all aspects of life, whether it's employment, um, recreation, or living. A lot of people with disabilities, because they're on social assistance, they can't get ahead in terms of buying a house and getting a job. So I think fighting for social inclusion and societal inclusion is big. I also think that more homes that are adaptable have to be built. And I think that employers, from a workforce perspective, have to really rethink their hiring processes and really make the commitment to hire people with disabilities. And I have a philosophy as it comes to that, and I'm happy to get into that if you would like me to.
I would love to hear your philosophy.
So, when it comes to hiring people with disabilities, I think employers have to follow what I call the three C's to success, Jackie. And the three C's to success, are first you have to make a commitment to wanting that as a culture in your organization. It's one thing to put for an equal opportunity employer at the end of a job description, but if you don't actually put it into practice, then that statement or statements ring hollow. So I think the first thing is the commitment to making that a part of your culture in the organization. And the second part is that then you have to disabilities flourish at work. Sometimes you don't always have to fit the person. You don't always have to fit the job to the person. You have to sometimes fit the person to the job, and certainly look at different ways of accomplishing the same goals. I always say it may not be aesthetically pleasing, but as long as the job gets done, I really don't care how it gets done. So the second part is you've got to create the conditions. And the last part is you have to celebrate the wins.
Yeah.
When you hire people with disabilities, you're creating an inclusive culture, and you're also creating a competitive edge over your competition. And like I said before, you reduce turnover, you increase morale, and you find new ways to solve problems. So, in my judgment, those are the three C's to success when you're looking to implement an inclusive culture.
I couldn't agree with you more. These are things that I've seen. These are issues that I've personally seen with my sister, and while I can't speak for her, but that I've seen the social isolation because she can't work because she's on social assistance. But when she has had jobs, when she's had good employers that have altered the work for her even just a little bit to make it easier for her to understand, she's thrived and made friends in those workplaces.
Well, Jackie, I think building connection community is important. And I think over the states, I know that you have the Americans with Disabilities Act, but I also know that there's still more work to do in terms of
Mhm.
making sure that folks with disabilities. Also, I think it's important for folks with disabilities, and I can speak from personal experience because I have a disability. I think it's important that we all work together politically, from a labor standpoint, and collectively to create, a variety of options for folks with disabilities. Uh, Starting out as a menial job or without the opportunity for advancement is another discourager for work, because if you don't create a condition where people can advance, and this is the same with people with disabilities, then they're going to be discouraged to work. So I think another thing we have to do is work to diversify the options of the opportunities that are out there for individuals with disabilities.
Yeah, my sister has made it clear that she doesn't want to clean toilets at McDonald's. That is not her goal or her dream in life.
I would certainly hope that um, government officials and folks with disabilities would have higher aspirations than that. That's a noble job for the folks that do it. But again, I think diversity and variety of opportunities is very important for sure.
It is. And when we're voting in the United States, we need to make sure and allow those who are disabled to get to their polling places and to actually get inside and vote. How can we make sure that people who are disabled are able to vote?
Well, I think it all starts with advocacy. I think that we've seen it in the states. For example, they just had a special election in Georgia for their Senate seat, as you know, and Raphael Warnock's campaign had to sue the state because they weren't going to allow people to vote the Saturday after Thanksgiving because it fell on holiday. So I think it starts with advocacy. I think people of Providence have to make this an issue, um, bring attention to it. But I also think folks with disabilities have to uh, navigate their own power. And what I mean by that is they have to put together whatever networks they have, because I've done this, so that I could. So I have a staff of support workers that work with me for exercise and running errands and scheduling. So I also think that more support staff have to be hired at a wage that is allowing them to live while doing this work. Because another barrier to entry is the fact that when you have folks with disabilities who are reliant upon personal support workers and they're not paid a fair wage, that's another barrier that you have to overcome. So I think it starts with advocacy. It also starts with paying support staff a livable wage. And it also starts with making sure that folks with disabilities have a platform within the government in terms of policy and how it's structured to make it sure that they also, we always talk about getting a piece of the pie. And for folks with disabilities, uh, I always say it's important to pull out a chair at the table of inclusion for folks with disabilities, and investing in our political process is certainly something they should be entitled to, and something that I certainly will continue to advocate for, because I think that it's an ongoing effort to making sure that folks with disabilities are visible, they're heard, and they're respected with forming opinions that matter to them, because your circumstances and what you're passionate about voting for uh, may be different than mine. So I think it starts with advocacy, paying support staff, and really making sure that when they get to the voters box, they have some booth, they have something to vote for sure. So those are the three things I think of when I think about voting.
I couldn't agree more with you. One of the problems in the United States is the Americans with Disability Act, while a federal law, is is what is called an unfunded mandate, which means that each state, the federal government does not give each state money to pay for these improvements on public buildings. So each state has to come up with magic money in order to pay for all of these different improvements. And I think one of the biggest things that the United States should do is fund the Americans with Disabilities Act fully, so that these states, some which have more money than others, can fully include all disabled people within its country, within life in general.
Yeah, I would agree with you. I mean, it's another way to make sure that folks with disabilities are included in all aspects of life. I think about the case out of Mississippi in the States, where you had uh, Brett Favre, the Hall of Fame quarterback, allegedly he took money from the poorest state in the union in terms of social economics in Mississippi. He took the money to divert it to build a volleyball arena for his daughter. I think he took over $1 million for a $5 million project. So I think when you have folks with disabilities and you have a mechanism to allow them to be fully included, I think it should be funded for sure. Absolutely.
Yeah. We need to, I think we need to take care of, not, okay, take care of isn't the right phraseology. We need to make sure that every person in both of our countries is able to participate in government, is able to get a job, and is able to live a full life and not feel as though they need to be isolated from the rest of the world.
Yeah, so, social and societal inclusion is big for sure.
And I mean, kids need to see other children with disabilities at a young age before the before they have any sort of preconceived notions of people with disabilities.
That would certainly help. Yeah.
I grew up meeting all of my sister's classmates, kids who were in wheelchairs, kids who were in crutches, and there was nothing unusual to me. And one of my friends, I remember someone was like, "Why are you friends with this person?" I'm like, "Because she's cool and she has color changing lipstick." And, when you're in the fourth grade, you think color changing lipstick is cool. And that is a reason to be friends with somebody. But people, people with disabilities are no different than anybody else. They just might need assistance in different ways.
Well, it goes back to what I said earlier. It may not always be aesthetically pleasing, but as long as it's productive, I don't care how it gets done, right?
Exactly. Exactly. We would go bowling. She would get bumpers. I'm like, "Oh, cool. Now I can beat my mother in bowling."
I, yeah, I'll tell you a quick story. When I was in high school, I did something that I probably shouldn't have done. So when people wanted to get through the hallways in high school, they would hop on the back of my battery pack
Oh
to get,
gosh.
to get through the halls of the high school faster. But no batteries were fortunately damaged, but it was a lot of fun. But I do think uh, people with disabilities deserve full access to societal inclusion in every aspect of life, for sure. And it's something that I have fought for my entire adult life. And I'll tell you, I actually have an identical twin brother, and my brother and I were both born with cerebral palsy. My brother grew out of his when we were 4 months old, but I did not, and I found out at 9 years old, Jackie, that I wouldn't be able to walk for the rest of my life. And um, I went to school the next day, and my middle school principal, her name was Dr. Carol Crewley, and she looked at me and she said, "The only limitations you'll have on your life are the artificial ones you place on yourself." So I didn't know it at the time, but I really think that was the turning point and the turning trajectory of my life for sure.
Yeah. Teachers make such a difference for everybody's life, but especially kids with disabilities. My sister had some really bad teachers when we lived in Tennessee, and my parents moved because these teachers literally just threw my sister in a classroom and weren't educating her. And then we moved to Illinois, and my sister was actually being educated, included into different classrooms, and it was the best thing for her, and she thrived throughout high school because we moved away from those schools that just threw her away.
Yeah, I think you make a valid point in terms of the geographical difference because uh, you look at for reference points, you look at the abortion debate you're having in the States. It's far more difficult to, whether you're for or against abortion, get one in the southern states as it is the Midwestern states. And I do think there's a geographical bias in terms of certain social services and the types of politicians that are being elected makes a difference for sure.
I couldn't agree with you more. Well, as we're about ready to hit the time limit on Zoom, I was just wondering if you had anything you would like to add, like to say to my audience before we close up shop.
Yeah, Jesse, I would simply say that inclusion is the gateway to independence. It's the model of my life, and it's something that I live my life by because I believe that everyone has a platform to share a story, and they should be able to do it. So make sure that you include all people of all abilities in all aspects of life. That would be my closing message to your audience.
Thank thank you so much, Kevin, for coming on to the Sexy Politico. If anybody would like to know more about Kevin, I'm going to leave all of his links in the show notes down below. Check out his YouTube page because his podcast, your is it a podcast as well, or is it just a YouTube show?
Yeah, so it's a podcast. It's a full-fledged podcast. So anybody that wants to see my stuff, just type my name and let's have this conversation, which is the name of the podcast, into either YouTube or wherever you get your podcast, and all my stuff comes
I've
up.
been watching it on YouTube, so that's why I'm like, wait, it could be on podcast as well.
Yeah, it's there's an audio version of it as well. And
Awesome.
I appreciate you watching the show. It's most appreciated.
Yeah, I'm like, let's do some research. Oh, this is awesome.
Oh, well, I try to make it easy for you. As an old journalist, I love all the information I can give to people, right?
Absolutely. And thank you so much for being on my show. And I'll be see everybody next week. So have a great day. Bye.